All right, so let's get started. Welcome everyone to Chevalier's Books Online. We are LA's oldest indie bookstore, established in 1940. Tonight, we are so glad to be working with the USC Shoah Foundation to celebrate Rachael Cerrotti's new book, We Share the Same Sky. This is a powerful memoir that weaves together the stories of two young women, Hannah as a refugee who remains one step ahead of the Nazis at every turn, and Rachael, whose insatiable curiosity to uncover the past guides her into the lives of countless strangers. So, a little bit more about Rachael. She is an award winning photographer, writer, educator, and audio producer. In 2019, she released a critically acclaimed podcast, which shares the same title, We Share the Same Sky. Here to interview Rachael tonight, we have with us Lisa Hofheimer, who serves as chair of the Shoah Foundation's Next Generation Council. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to our two speakers, Rachael and Lisa. If you would both please take it away.
Hey, Rachael.
Hi, Lisa.
How are you?
Good. It's good to be here. And thank you, Teresa.
Thank you so much, Teresa. It's wonderful to be here at Chevalier's. It's a neighborhood bookstore of mine, and my family loves it. So thank you. And Rachael, in the words of Nancy Spielberg, wow, wow, wow. Really extraordinary, extraordinary book. The podcast, took my breath away. The way you interwove your own journey into your grandmother's story of survival was just fascinating and brilliant. And I would love to understand sort of how we got to where we sit today. So the sort of seed that started it all, that led you to the Shoah Foundation, that in turn moved on to the podcast and all of that. So if you could elaborate, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I'm going to do my quick version of a very long story, which was that back in 2009, which was the start of this project that has become known as We Share the Same Sky, which is a podcast and my book, which came out last week. Back in 2009, I was a very, I guess you could say, a disgruntled college student. I didn't choose the right university for me. I was trying to figure out what to do. Where to be, was figuring out my path, but I knew I really wanted to be a photojournalist, and that was like a very clear intention of mine. And one of the pieces of advice that a lot of young storytellers were told at that time was pick a story and start a blog. Blogs are not as popular these days, but I think pick a story is still a pretty good starting point for a young storyteller. And I knew that my grandmother had this incredible survival story. My grandmother's Holocaust history was not, this story is not about a secret archive. It's not about family history that was hidden. This is about family history that was front and center, and not in a way that as a grandchild, it felt like it weighed me down, and not in a way where it felt like it defined me, or, it just kind of was. It was part of the life. And my grandmother was getting towards the end of her life, and I figured, well, this would be a nice way to spend some one-on-one time with her. And so we started these storytelling sessions, and I didn't have the vocabulary at that time, but really what I was doing was taking her testimony, where she would tell me her stories and I would type. I was 20 then, and I graduated college. She passed away my senior year of college, and then I graduated, and upon my graduation, I started to become more and more invested in this story, and was discovering that my grandmother left behind this incredible archive where she left behind diaries and photographs and all these types of primary source documents. And being an aspiring journalist, I was like, oh, I'm going to become the unofficial family historian here. Fast forward 4 years, where I spent majority of my time working odd jobs that most creatives do. So waitressing, travel industry, wedding photography, all that stuff. But I
do it.
I miss some of that work sometimes. And I was digitizing her archive along the way. So I started retyping her diaries, and I started scanning her photographs and really paying very close attention to where did she go when, who was she with. And the story I was interested in was not Holocaust history. That is something that grew out of her story, that is now a big interest of mine. But I was really interested in displacement and communities that were living outside of their native lands, I guess you could say, because that really was kind of the theme that I resonated with and what felt really relevant. 2014 comes and I pack a backpack and go on the road for a year. And I was like, I'm going to follow her story, because as a photographer, you have to get out there and you have to photograph. And I can't just write this book from my bedroom floor. Like I said, I'm speeding. There's a lot of stuff. We'll go back to some of that. But I want to get forward to the connection with Shoah Foundation, which I'm really grateful is doing this event with us tonight, where circa 2017, 2018, I'd been pretty in depth, this project had become my life by that point, 7-8 years in. And Stephen Smith, executive director of Shoah Foundation, found me on Instagram, of all places.
Of course he did. Of course he did.
Neither of us are like super advanced at social media, so I don't know how that one happened, but it was like the right hashtag at the right time. And he took a deep dive into my work and reached out to me. And at that time, I have to say, there was no podcast and there was no book. So becoming interested in my personal journey I give him a lot of credit. And reached out to me and said, like, hey, is your grandmother in Shoah Foundation archive? And at that time, once again, didn't have the vocabulary. At that time, I was like, oh, Steven Spielberg's project, because that's what a lot of his descendants know it as.
Of course, yeah.
And a few minutes later, I had a 4.5-hour audio-visual testimony of my grandmother's, which was like the missing piece after all these years of work, was that I hadn't had her voice of a video like that. And that kind of spiraled into the podcast, which then made way for the book. And so, like I said, very long story in a very short period. So hopefully that sets a scene for why we are here tonight. And I'm very happy to be virtually in LA tonight, because I'm on the other coast.
Wow. I mean, just the fact that you really didn't see her testimony and hear her testimony until you had completed your journey and your traveling through Europe.
Yeah, and I think for those who might be here who don't know like what we mean by testimony, it's like Shoah Foundation has these 55,000 plus now audiovisual testimonies of survivors and witnesses of genocide. And I think that just like, and I hear this from a lot of descendants now who reach out to me now that I get to work with Shoah Foundation. People, oh yeah, my grandparent is in the archive, but you don't really know what that means. And, so a lot of times I question myself where I'm like, wow, was I a really bad journalist? Because I like never went to Shoah Foundation, but I don't think I even understood what I didn't have.
Right.
And so then, when I got sent this 4.5-hour testimony, it did two things. It opened up a path for me to think about audio storytelling in a very different way, which was something that I kind of tripped and by accident fell into and really love. And that was like my primary day-to-day job. But it also helped me corroborate a lot of what my grandmother had told me in our initial conversations, because I didn't record those. I typed them. So it was a very different listening experience. And so I was able to kind of fact check my own stories through my grandmother's.
And you could feel the pauses and the sighs and the feeling.
Yes, and I knew when she told Shoah Foundation a different story than she told me.
Excellent.
Which I love, because this book is all about memory, and I'm really fascinated by memory. And one of the really interesting things about memory is that it's very flexible and it's fallible, but it changes with time, and our stories are completely different depending who we're telling them to. So one of the reasons I wanted to sit down with my grandmother was because I was really curious how she would tell her story to a granddaughter. Like she talked about womanhood more with me than I think she did in other retellings. She shared with me like secrets that, that she didn't share with Shoah Foundation, and she kind of glossed over, and I could see those holes.
That's very funny. That's very funny.
But yeah, but I think that's what sustained my interest in this project for so many years, is that like when we retell stories, we tell them differently based off of what's happening in the world around us, who we're talking to. And so it's been a gift to be able to have so many different retellings of her story.
Well, and her life was so big and so textured. And there was pain, and there was sadness, and there was beauty, and there was joy. And wow, did I love the fact that she would drink your crazy concoctions just to make you all laugh. What struck me so much was when you were just talking before about where the thrust of what you were thinking about when you began this journey was displacement.
Mm-hmm.
And while you happened along this journey, the world saw the largest migrant crisis that the world has seen since World War II, and that was at your doorstep at the time. And how did you integrate that experience into following Hannah's journey?
Yeah. So like I said, in the beginning, it was these 4 or 5 years of going through this archive that she left behind, which honestly I'm still not done with. And I'm kind of scared to touch at this point after creating, after writing the story, because I'm both simultaneously scared I'm going to find something so amazing I should have included, but also, scared for contradictions, as we all oftentimes are with memory. But when I got into traveling, 2014 to 2015 was my year where I went out and I said, if I'm a photographer, I have to show up to these places. I have my camera. And so I went out and retraced my grandmother's path of displacement. And my goal was to follow her 17 years of displacement. So, which was really when she lost her Czech citizenship when she was 14 years old, really 13, but left Prague when she was 14 on a rescue mission, and was stateless until 1956 when she became an American citizen. And so that was really my period of history that I was centered on. Of course, to study a period of history, you need to know before and after. So really, it was an expanded version of that. But I would say when I set out to Europe in 2014, the fall of 2014, I was on this very linear path of thinking. It was a little bit more sugar-coated of a story. And it was like more of a narrative of, look how bad it was then and look how much better it is now. And I'm pretty much the same demographic as my grandmother was, mine as she was born in Europe and I was born here. We both grew up assimilated, fairly secular Jewish kids in an urban metropolis that was diverse. And so I'm traveling around Europe and not showing my passport to anybody, and really kind of just living what one guy one told me was the American dream, was have an idea and go after it. And then by the end of 2015, when I had gotten back to America and was supposedly slowing down on these travels, which was absolutely not the case, but what I thought then was slowing down, the refugee crisis broke out. And Scandinavia, which is where my grandmother was able to have refuge during the war, became one of the primary places that refugees and migrants were trying to get to. And so I started seeing all these headlines that were very reminiscent to the issues that were happening in my grandmother's generation, and not just the statistics, which were incredibly jarring, but you have the images of people crossing by boat, which is my grandmother's story involves the rescue of the Danish Jews, which is a big part of my research. So, she was saved on an illegal boat ride from one country to another. So you're seeing, and coming from the photojournalism world, I'm watching colleagues of mine being sent to places like Greece and Italy to follow this contemporary crisis. But I'm also meeting young people who fled home without their parents, hoping that someone would give them asylum in Scandinavia. And so the story went from being this very linear journey to being something very cyclical. And it felt like it would be irresponsible to not tell the story with that layer into it. Like, what would be the point? I mean, I was always interested in the contemporary angle. So it felt like, well, I have to address this. And the more I got invested in it, the more symbolism I found in different places I was going, the more connections I was meeting, the more people I was talking to. And I was it became a very important layer in conversations with people, as well as the stories that I was documenting with my camera and with my words.
Of course. And also thinking about sort of the people that you met along the way and the way your thinking might have been influenced by their own journeys. And I'm speaking particularly of Rabbi Melchior, Bent Melchior, and how his trajectory in human rights work and Hannah's trajectory in the life that she led of being so open with you as a young woman and trying to empower you as a woman, and her own experiences butting up against racism in the United States, how that was all enmeshed in your own exploration of their story of survival.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
love
it's the,
it's loaded, I know.
yeah, but I think one of the big ways that I've described this project over the years is like, to me, it feels like this big spider web where if you pull a little like string over here, something down here moves. And maybe that's a different part of the world, and over here something happens. Maybe it's a different part of history. And so all of these characters, I mean, first of all, a lot of the characters you meet in this book, I didn't know when I started this project. And one of the lines, I'm gonna kind of mess up my own line here from the podcast, but I talk about how I went out to chase the dead and I found myself a beautiful life, in the sense that I went out in search of my grandmother's history, and she was the only survivor of the Holocaust in her family. She left when she was 14. She was on her own that entire time. And so really I was seeking out her memories and trying to figure out how to document her memories in a contemporary time, which if I said that every time I said that in photojournalist communities, they'd be like, what are you talking about? I'm like, I don't know, I have to figure it out. Hold on, I'll be back in like 10 years, give me time. But what I started to find was like all these connections that were living within this story that were very alive and very present. So, you mentioned Rabbi Melchior, who sadly passed away a few weeks ago at the age of 92. And the reason I got in touch with him, and he becomes this hugely important character throughout the story. He's the former chief rabbi of Denmark, and was an incredible symbol of the rescue of the Danish Jews. And for those who are here who don't know much about that history, Denmark saved 95% of their Jewish population during World War II.
It's unbelievable.
Absolutely unbelievable, as a result of a very spontaneous 3-week, essentially, rescue mission, illegally ferrying Danish Jews, Jewish refugees living in Denmark, and members of the underground and their family members across to Sweden. And it's an incredible rescue story that went from the ground up. And also Denmark is one of the only, I think it's the only country.
The only country, right, yeah.
Donations by Yad Vashem as well, for saving their Jewish population. And so, this story is very symbolic. It's very important. And my grandmother happened to be on the same refugee boat as this very, prominent rabbi family. And Bent was a young teen on the same boat as her. And when she was retelling me her stories back when I was in college, figuring out my life, and she mentioned this family, fast forward a bunch of years later, when I get to Scandinavia and I reach out and I find him, and suddenly he becomes this very integrated part of this story. And so, that web that I was talking about, it's like, she told me something here, and then suddenly I meet this person who over the past 5-6 years, this man became a grandfather to me, literally. And I was spending Rosh Hashanah with him every year, and really, felt incredibly close to him. But he completely changed the way I saw my grandmother's story. And that's what kept happening over and over, is that I would meet these different people. I moved in with the family of descendants of people who saved my grandmother. I would meet all these people and hear their stories and hear how they remembered this history that I grew up hearing. And all these stories made each other whole in a way. And so that's really what the part of what the book explores.
Absolutely. And I mean, look, just to say also about Denmark, what I was so moved about was how they saved everyone's property as well.
Yes.
And they had parades for people as they came back.
Yes.
And welcomed the Jews back into their communities and into their homes and preserved them as though they were always coming back. And I had never known that story, and it was so beautiful to hear.
It is. And I'll read a short paragraph in the book because it brings together, sorry, truck outside. It brings together these past couple questions you were asking me about, the connection of what's happening in the world today and the way that I decided to write and tell this history of World War II, with also the way that these characters who somehow interconnected with my grandmother's story. So just the passage I'll read is sitting at Rabbi Melchior's home. I believe this was summer of 2016. And he lived in Copenhagen, and we would sit there and we would talk. And I have to say, this man let me record every single conversation I ever had with him. So I'm very grateful for that.
He was a gift, and his son is a gift to humanity as well. So, as you know, yes.
This call will just become a love note to their family. But so we were talking about the refugee crisis that was unfolding in Scandinavia, and so that's what this is about. Bent sat back in his chair, pulling on the wire of the small microphone I had clipped to his shirt. When the Second World War ended, we were extremely optimistic, he began to say. That was still even before we heard the terrible things that happened in the camps, but we thought that mankind had suffered so much that they would understand that war was not the answer. I mean, we had lived to see miracles happen on the sea. And I think of these thousands of people who have tried to come over the Mediterranean today. I think this is a shame on our generation and of our time that we let this catastrophe happen. I don't know how that would be forgiven, because you can think of refugees in one way and another way, but here you have human beings dying. So forget whether they are right or wrong. To begin with, you have to save them. And I think, I think it would have been impossible I wouldn't have wanted to, but I think it would have been a bit impossible to tell the story of World War II without layering in what was happening, because these were our conversations. We couldn't talk about a heroic event like the rescue of the Danish Jews while ignoring what was happening in the Mediterranean. It would have been human of us.
Or Afghanistan today, right? Like so we keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again. And one thing that really spoke to me so loudly was your sort of private reflections along the way of your journey. And at one point, you said, "How could I have thought I could be the narrator of a story I knew nothing about?" And I think it was when you were at the farm, at Sini's farm, when you said that, and you were trying to find your wholeness and your right to tell this story.
Yeah.
And wait, I have one more part. I'm sorry. And I want to know sort of how that might have changed. And spoiler alert for everybody. And Rachel and I talked about this. So how this changed, how that narrative might have changed after you lost Sergio.
Yeah. So in 26, so I was, I started this project as a lost and confused college student, a 20-year-old. And so now I'm 32 and I'm just publishing this. So the book not only is, a biography of sorts of my grandmother, a history lesson of sorts, it's also me going through my 20s and what it felt like to be living essentially inside of a period of history that wasn't my own during this very transformative decade that we go through. So in that time, I got married in 2015, and less than a year later, I was widowed, and that's Sergio, and he's my late husband. And we had met when we were college students. We were friends for a while, and he was European, he was Polish, and he's a huge part of this book because he was a huge part of my research and my life in all the ways. But in the early parts, he wasn't going to be a character, I guess you could say. It's weird to talk about your life like that, but it's kind of necessary when talking about the book. And when he passed away, so the line that you reflected on was, I thought about it a lot on CNA's farm, but the first time that idea really hit me was after Sergio passed away, and he died in September 2016. Coming up will be 5 years from an undiagnosed heart disease at the age of 28. And sitting in the hospital, I remember thinking that line specifically because, and I talk about this in the podcast and I write about it in the book, where I felt like a fraud in a way. My grandmother's war story is a grief story. But, the same way that earlier I was saying, I didn't have the language around what is testimony and, what is this way of, oral history and whatnot. I also didn't have the language of grief. I was 20 something, I was like working in restaurants and photographing weddings and working on travel programs. Like I was beautifully naive to that feeling, which was a very light period of my life. And then being widowed, it was my own experience with grief that highlighted how deeply I didn't understand my grandmother. And so this very pervasive thought started to enter my world of, what right do I have to tell my grandmother's story? How can I even touch her story? Which, we could talk about that for a long time because, what my job on the day-to-day basis now is to tell other people's family history, and you could ask the same question, what right do I have to retell it? I wasn't there. I don't know it. But that's how storytelling happens. That's what we have to do. So, it became a really heavy theme, and it still is a heavy theme in my life of, that question of what right do I have to tell someone else's story? And, but the interesting thing about grief coming into my own life was that it helped me, like I was going back through my grandmother's diaries after that, rereading all the things I had read before. And I was like picking up
new meaning.
Yeah, everything had new meaning, and I was like certain passages were standing out to me that never stood out to me before. And so in some way that became the meditation, was not that I don't have a right to tell this, but how interesting is it that stories change over time, right? And it goes back to the idea of memory, like the memory of my travels change when somebody passes away. The memory changes, and so
of course. So it was a story of survival, but it transformed into a meditation on grief and death and why we're all here and what our responsibility is.
Yeah, and I had no idea that's what I was going out to write, and that was just a product of pivoting, and
right.
And I think that's kind of, I don't know, I think that's what's kept me engaged in, doing a story for 12 years, retelling the same story to myself over and over again. And even every time I have a conversation, depending who I'm talking to, I find myself saying, I'm one of those people, I don't know what I'm saying until it comes out of my mouth, but I find myself saying things that, that I'm like, I never would have thought that, because somebody asks you a question, suddenly like there's another layer to memory. I don't know. I think there's some study that says like every time we retell a story, we like remember it a little bit differently.
A little bit differently. And it's also contextualized to your current situation now of what you're going to focus on in that memory.
Yes. And and what's around you. So, absolutely. And so I probably wouldn't have focused so much on my grandmother's grief in the book had I not gone through that. There are so many other versions of what this book could be. And this book is what it is because of what was happening in my personal life, what was happening politically around me, and what was happening culturally too, changed what I pulled out of my grandmother's story, what felt relevant, and mostly like what felt meaningful for me, what kept me engaged with the history.
Of course. I want to ask you about the inheritance of memory.
My favorite
and topic. Yes, I know that. And your mom's experience of inheriting grief and pain and protecting you to a large extent from that grief and pain, and what you think, and I know I don't expect you to speak as, as a representative for the third generation, for all three Gs out there, because I know everybody has their own experience, but what you think the difference is between 2G and 3G, and that's second generation and third generation survivors of genocides, for those people that didn't understand my abbreviations there.
So I will also preface and say I'm not the spokesperson for sure. And it's when the podcast came out a couple of years ago, I had friends of mine who also come from a Jewish background and have family who perished during the war. Say, I just can't listen to your podcast. And I said, first of all, that's totally fine. This is a heavy topic and nobody has to listen to anything. There's lots of stuff out there. But they more so felt just like they couldn't touch it. And even after I said, well, I was like, it's Holocaust history, but it's also very contemporary. And it's, there's a lot of other stuff
in it.
It's not straightforward, a Holocaust story. And they just said, like, I said, okay. So I preface that by saying, I say that, because for me, I'm able to be engaged with this stuff every day, and I have peers who can't touch it at all. Yeah. But with that being said, speaking to my own reflections on this, and I'm very lucky to have very supportive parents who talk to me a lot about this stuff, and 100% the apple didn't fall far from the tree. They both love family history, and my dad is an expert in Native American genocide. So, the interests were inherited as well as the memory. But for my mom, she is the middle child of 3 siblings of my grandmother's. And it is just known in the family that she was the child who took on her mother's history in a much heavier way. I would say there's like always one person in the family, right, who kind of carries it in a really heavy way, and that was my mom. She was the one who had nightmares, and she was the one who feared it and felt that emotional connection to her mother in a very visceral manner. And so in the explorations we've done together, and we've gone back to the town in Czech Republic where my grandmother was born, and we've touched family history together in Europe. And I remember the first time we went back to Czech Republic together, which is where my grandmother fled from originally. There was this whole event in this small town, and me and my mom were like, we were like centerpieces. We were like proof, like living, walking memorials that there were Jews here once. And all these journalists wanted to talk to us. And and I was 24, 25 at the time. This is pre-marriage, pre-heaviness, all that stuff. And all these journalists are asking us questions, and my mom was very somber about it all. And for her, it felt creepy. It felt like this uncomfortable heaviness, this like we shouldn't be here type of feeling. And admittedly, I was kind of like, this is cool. Like, this is cool. Like we're back in the, and that's where my great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather's store was. And this is where, she would have gone to school. And this is where my grandmother would have gone off the train to go see her grandparents. And I'm going back in my mind, no, I always took the train to go see my grandmother. And just that separation, that generational difference just made it much easier for me to touch it. It made it much easier to be there. I will say now, older, wiser, and just a little bit more awake to the world around me and more knowledgeable of the history behind me. I don't know if I could have that same response going back there today. And I will go back there at some point. I'll be curious how it feels. But that whole idea of like ignorance is bliss, even though I had spent all these years into my grandmother's archive, but at that point, I don't think it really had registered yet. Like it was still this exploration. So so that's, that's just, I say that story as like an example of the generational difference. And then just to follow up really quickly on that, my mom and I have talked about a lot, like she never could have done this, spend this many years. And I don't think she could work in the field of Holocaust history or genocide history. It's too personal.
Too close.
And it's incredibly personal to me, but it's that much more personal to her that it's just too hard. And that's why I'm doing it. And I always say, like, I think for third generation, my take on it is that for my mom, it's pain, and for me, it's responsibility. Right. And I think that's really the transfer there in terms of the inheritance, is that I really do feel, I felt responsible to talk about the refugee crisis. I felt responsible to talk about the grief. I felt responsible to make it contemporary. And my mom has no responsibility for that.
No, she still has the pain from the interviews that you shared, and we share the same Scott in the podcast. The pain was still, you could hear it in her voice.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And okay. And so sort of bringing it back and taking us back to sort of weaving in testimony and technology into storytelling. And, I have to say, I read the book because you sent it to me as a PDF, and it wasn't published yet. Don't worry, it wasn't that you should send me a bad. She didn't do anything illegal, but I read the copy, and then as soon as it came out, I think I told you I needed to hear you reading it to me because your voice was so amazing in the podcast, as was Hannah's, but I needed to hear you tell the story in your voice. And afterwards, we had a conversation about that. And I'd love for you to share that, because it wasn't a given that you were going to be the reader.
No, I had to audition for the part.
Which I thought was the most hilarious thing. Yeah.
I had to audition, but I was like, I have a podcast by the same name. No, I had to audition. And, reading it was a very different experience to read it, even out loud. I mean, because I had the experience of doing the podcast behind me, which was a very different narrative experience. So when recording podcasts, you do take after take, and I stitch my voice together. Did I say this word better on this sentence or this word? Right. So, but also I was able to script it for words I felt comfortable saying. So my little bit of humor about the audiobook that I'm slowly making my way through it too, which feels like a weird act to hear myself reading for that many hours. But there's this book travels through a lot of different countries, and, it's me as an American, but I go through Central Europe, and I go through Scandinavia, and I go through the countries that my grandmother was in. And then also I'm going to places that she wasn't, because my own personal life is taking me. Exactly. And so there's a lot of foreign words, and I'm not good at accents. Right. Just, I wish I was. I'd be such a better storyteller if I was, particularly falling into the field of podcasting, but I'm not. I've accepted it. And so I was going through the book and getting to, the place where I have a little anecdote in there where I list out some of the hardest Polish words for an American to pronounce, because it was a part of an experience, was the activity. And I just, I was like, oh no. I was like, what did I just do to myself?
What did you do to yourself? Yep.
Hopefully, that feels kind of fun and a bit of an insight to what it felt like living in all these countries for all these years, and more often than not speaking the language of the people around me, because that was a really interesting part about being so deep inside this history, but living with people who I didn't speak their language. So the only things I knew were what people translated for me. So, going back to that idea of memory and the stories we're told, when I was in Sweden and spending time with the descendants of the fishermen who saved my grandmother during World War II, this incredible connection that I had no idea that I would find, there was one or two family members that had good enough English to translate. But the individuals who were there, who were older, they didn't speak a word of English. I didn't speak a word of Swedish. So I would ask a question, it would get translated. and then I would hear someone, give a monologue for a 5-minute answer. And then I would get like a 3-sentence
3
translation.
words. Yeah.
But, that's kind of what, and I, there'd all be like laughter around me. I'd be like, translate the joke. And you can't translate jokes very well. And, children filter for their parents sometimes too.
Yep.
But every time
parents
that would
filter for their children.
And but whenever that would happen, it was insight for me, and it helped me touch a little bit more of my grandmother's experience, in the sense of when she was telling me stories about her first time getting to Sweden, and she was telling me about the conversation around her, I'd be like, well, how did you know what the conversation was? Did you speak? But this is what gets passed from one generation to the next.
Yeah.
And that's what I was interested in with this book, was less about, what the German archives are going to tell me about what happened to my family, and more about like the cultural anecdotes that get passed down. Like, what are the things that form my identity as a third generation, and then change how I see the world around me, how I interact with it. So those little funny cultural things actually have huge symbolism when you place it in the context of family history, at least for me.
Yeah, well, you explore all of these things with such brilliance, and in such a textured way. I mean, through history, through language, through friendships, just the 4 generations of family friends that you sort of reconnected. All of the connective tissue in your book is all of these relationships that you revitalized and added so much meaning to the memories of both your family and of all of the people that saved them as well. So, I thank you more than anything for sharing this with us. And I do want to start, I think, want to start to open some questions up. Oh, there's Teresa. Thank you. Thanks.
All right. So we're going to get into the audience Q&A. If you haven't had the chance to type your question into the Q&A box, make sure to do that now, and we will get to them. I'm going to go ahead and start with the first question from Bert Deixler, co-owner of Chevalier's books, who wants to know, Rachel, what question do you now wish you had asked your grandmother but didn't know to ask then?
Great question. So many things, but I would say the number one thing is, how did you save all these documents from pre-war, during the war, during her travels? Because what my grandmother left behind is such a gift not to be taken for granted. Hundreds of beautiful photographs from the 1920s, the 30s, the 40s, letters between her and her parents during the war, but I didn't know any of this existed till after she passed away. And it's one of the most common questions I get is like, how did your grandmother save all this? And I'm like, I don't know. My guess is that a lot of it was saved in Prague, and when she returned in 1946 to see who was alive, my guess is, I know that she took some stuff, so I'm assuming she took more than I realized, but even there, she still had some years of statelessness in Europe before she immigrated to America. And then in America, she was like, spent some years traveling and trying to figure out where to live and how to settle down. So I don't know how she got any of that, and I wish I had like a very concrete answer. And then the other question I want to ask her is like how she was so good at languages, because in the book you'll read this beautiful letter that she writes just like a year after getting to America, and she was upset by a boy and crosses the country by train and is setting out from Cincinnati to California, and she's going to go to San Francisco. And I would say it was like the most empowered moment of her story, because it was this choice to go somewhere, and everything in her prior 11 or so years nothing was a choice. And this was a choice. And she writes this beautiful letter to her friend, but like the English is so good and her words are so poetic that it just doesn't completely make sense to me that she wrote it in 1951. So that's like, it's just like, how are you? I mean, she was gifted in languages, but that's really gifted. So those are my big curiosities I'm gonna have to live with for the rest of my life.
That's awesome. I'm curious if after seeing, how well she was able to keep the records of her life, do you find yourself also now obsessively keeping your correspondences and memories and you're like, in 80 years, someone's gonna want to see these things?
100%, like to an obsessive, like to a problematic degree. When I got my like recent passport picture and it was just like I don't want to show it to people. And I was like, my first thought was like, oh my God, if I ever have grandkids, they're going to see the picture one day. Look at them. I'm like in the prime of my life. I'm in my 30s. I was like, this is so weird. No, I absolutely do. And then, but I like am concerned with myself with everything being digital. And so my like 2 quick notes on that is I want to take my advice and print out pictures and write on the back who people are and what year, because I think that handwritten captions have been more helpful to me than almost any other piece of evidence, we'll call it, in terms of her life. So I really would like to get better about doing that. And also there's something really beautiful about knowing that we just don't need as many pictures as we take. And as a photographer, I'm feeling that more and more, where my grandmother's like, I don't know, I'm kind of making this up, let's say like 100 photographs from the 1940s altogether, which is a lot, I think, to have from the 1940s. Mm-hmm. But I can easily take 100 pictures in like an evening hanging out with friends with my phone, and then they just live on a hard drive. And I'm like, nobody's going to ever go through. One, they're not going to know how to get into my hard drive. And then 2, they're going to go through that many pictures and screenshots and all this stuff. So it almost feels like having her beautiful archive almost makes me want to have less of my own, where like, let me just pick certain things and just delete the rest and send them into the digital trash bin.
Void.
But yeah, it definitely, and then it's like, I wonder if anyone's going to read my diaries one day. And I think about that when I write them, and I'm like, oh no.
That's too private for your diary.
No, I know my mom ripped out a couple of pages of my grandmother's diaries before she let me have them. Because my grandmother was divorced from my mom's father, and I didn't know him very well because he died when I was very young, and she just felt like she didn't want me to like know him through those memories that my grandmother had. So
Interesting. I have a question here that is kind of connected to what you just said. Someone is curious about how the rest of your family may have reacted to this project and hearing your grandmother's story, because it sounds like quite the responsibility. So could you talk a little bit about that if you can?
Yeah, I've been really, really lucky that no one challenged me on this. I don't think anybody really understood what I was doing until the podcast came out. I think that's the lonely piece of this work, is that all the life that lives in this book, I was living and nobody understood what I was doing, so that lingers in me still. But even though nobody knew what I was doing, everybody was really supportive. And I think it's something about being a descendant of a victim, is that there's this kind of applause that you get for remembering the story. And particularly in Jewish culture, it's a huge piece of our culture to pass stories from one generation to the next. And I love that. I think it's my favorite part of being Jewish. So I've been really, really lucky in that sense. I think that most of my family, my grandmother was so the matriarch of our family. She was such a character that I think everyone's really grateful. I think that they're also like amazed that like students are studying her story through the educational efforts of USC Shoah Foundation and Eyewitness Echoes and Reflections. Like that people are actually studying her words is remarkable. But I will say that my cousins are like just reading the book for the first time now. So even like during this talk, I'm getting like messages from them that I'm not looking at, where I'm like, because they're my scariest audience, because they have, their own memories of my grandmother, and they're going to be very different than mine. So far, so good.
We've got a couple people actually with the same question, wanting to know, do you ever intend to maybe publish the journals directly? Colleen in particular is curious about your grandmother's arc and practice of journaling. Do you think you would ever see those?
I would love to. I would love, it's just a matter of like finding the publisher for it, but I would really love to publish a collection of her stories, because she was a gifted writer. And I always say, had she lived in a different generation or had grew up in a different place, where she had more opportunities, I think she would have been in the same field I am. So hopefully one day.
Okay, so we've got a question from a Holly Ramirez who wants to know, throughout the process of weaving this story for so many years, what was the greatest lesson you'd say that you learned both professionally and personally?
That we live in a world of emotional contradictions. This book is it's a deep meditation on grief and death and life. And I would say it's about how to be empowered by your grief. And I think one of the big lessons I learned is how much joy lives inside of loss, and what joy can live inside of memories that are hard and challenging. And once again, maybe that's my generational thing that I can feel that, but I'm not even really referring to my grandmother's grief because I don't know how to speak to that. It'd be very quick for me to say there was no joy in that. But then again, because of the war, she had her kids and her grandkids, and I know she was joyful with us. So, I don't know, I can't speak for her on that behalf, but I know for my own self, the world, so many conversations were had about, and with Rabbi Melchior, he was my big spiritual guide on this stuff, where we would talk about, how can I feel grateful for something I lost? How can I feel grateful? My husband's passing really brought me closer with all these people. And those were beautiful relationships that got stronger because I lost a relationship. And that I'm grateful for those relationships. And those types of things were really hard for me in the beginning. Now, many years later, I feel quite comfortable with them on most days. There's still the days that get me down. But I think that's my big lesson that I try to put into action more than anything else, is that it's okay to feel competing emotions at the same time. They're both real and honest and good, and that's what being human is. So
I'm curious also, professionally as a storyteller, because you sat with this project for so many years, was there a point where you were like, oh, now I have the tools that I need and the mental fortitude or whatever to really tackle this project and bring it into reality? If there was a sort of actual pivotal point where you're like, I'm ready now to sit down at my desk.
Yes, and that's such a good bringing it full circle question, because I think it was Shoah Foundation. So you set me up really nicely for that one. Yeah, so around after my husband passed, I was going back and forth Europe to America a lot, and also with what was happening politically. He passed away a month before Trump came into office, and so the world just has not been the same since 2016. And so all of this, I had a full version of this manuscript before he passed away, and then that kind of got put away, and little bits and pieces came with me, but mostly it got rewritten. And I was going back and forth to Europe, and I was exploring it. And then it was really getting my grandmother's testimony and some other professional things that happened along the way, where I did this really great collaboration with NPR, who produced this beautiful multimedia series. I heard for the first time my story being told in audio storytelling form, which was new for me. So that was very eye-opening. And simultaneously, I had sparked a friendship with a grandchild of an SS officer named Julie Lindahl, who wrote a beautiful book called The Pendulum. And around that time, I was having these culminating conversations of, okay, the world is changing really rapidly beneath my feet and starting to feel really overwhelming. At a certain point, I need to stop the story for my own mental health well-being. And it took a while, but that was around the time. But then it was really in producing the podcast that, I pretty much holed up in my little basement apartment in Boston for 9 months to produce that. Before, social isolation was a thing, I was socially isolating to do that. And that was just this time where I took all these years of work and just sat with it. And that really became kind of the end, I guess, of, and so the book really, it really ends around the time the podcast finishes being produced. Even I don't really talk about the podcast in the book, but that's around the time that the story stops. And of course the story keeps going, but that was the story being written had to, there needs to be an end eventually. And it was time for me personally to start to close a chapter, which is now, I think with the publication of this book, really starting to feel actually closed.
For sure. And so we've got a couple questions asking about that, which is, one is from Dawn, who wants to know, what did it feel like when you finally sent the book off to the publisher? And if there was a sense of completion to this long project? In addition to that, what was it like to finally physically hold your book after 12 long years? Please enlighten us.
Wild. I remember the first thing I looked at, I was like, oh, it's like a readable size. And that made me really happy. Because I think the document of words that got cut from this book is twice as long as the book actually is. So it felt great to send it off, because I mean, had anybody told me I was starting a 10-year long project, there's no way I would have started it. Like, you can't take on something that big. Like, it's just, that's like climbing Everest, you know, having never climbed before. And it was just, you know, it just took that long. So like I said, I needed it to be done when it was done. And that felt right. It felt very natural. It didn't feel forced. And I have to say, at no point in this project did it ever feel forced. And I think that that's part of why I love it so much, is that it just felt like the natural progression of exploring this history and my own identity. But I will say that there is like a huge fear in ending it. I mean, I've gone through a lot, good and bad, in the years of writing this. And in those bad moments, this book has been my lifeline. You know, like, I have a lot of widowed friends who have kids, and they say to me, you know, like, I don't know how I'd, especially in the early days of grief, like, I don't know how I'd get out of bed in the morning if I didn't have my child. And for me, like, my child was this book, and my child was my grandmother's story. Like, that was my motivation. It was like the only thing I was able to cling to was telling this history, going back and forth to Europe, having these conversations, exploring the corners of grief and what it meant spiritually and what it meant historically. And that was my lifeline. So there's a fear in it being over, because, like, if it's over, it's a little bit of a now what, even though I've plenty of work and I have plenty of meaning in all the other family stories I get to tell with Shoah Foundation. And that will become a new lifeline for me. But you know, there's a fear when a large project is done, and I'm feeling it, but it also feels great. So it's the emotional contradictions, you know, hitting me strong.
That leads to, I think, the perfect closing for our evening. Lee Lieberman and Karen Kruger wants to know, what is next for Rachael? What are your plans from this stage forward?
Oh gosh, I don't know. You tell me. I don't know. I mean, right now I have the privilege of working as the storyteller in residence for Shoah Foundation. So I'm co-producing we're co-hosting a podcast called The Memory Generation with Stephen Smith, who's the executive director of Shoah Foundation, and that's a monthly podcast.
It's wonderful.
Dig into the inheritance of memory. So all these topics, and we talk about with other people about other family histories and, you know, symbolic people of history who documented war and left memories for us to learn about and expand upon. So that's a beautiful part of my life right now, and getting to work with all these other testimonies, you know, and it's such a gift that my grandmother gave me, which was becoming interested in her story has made me get interested in all these other stories. So I'll keep telling them, and then I don't know, we'll see. I started this project as a photojournalist, so I keep telling myself that there has to be some visual outcome of this story. So what that will be is still in my head percolating, but
maybe there's a documentary. Maybe there's a documentarian somewhere out there on the webinar that has an interest in this.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I have over 100,000 photographs in the archive, so at some point I got to touch them.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the Memory Generation link is in the chat box if you're interested in that. Of course, we want to give a warm thank you to both of our speakers tonight, Rachael Cerrotti and Lisa Hofheimer. Thank you so much both for sharing your time and sharing your stories with us tonight. I am also going to remind everyone once again that you can buy a copy online of We Share the Same Sky with the link in the chat box to support Chevalier's books and more author evenings like this. And before we log off for the evening, Lisa and Rachel, do either of you have any last words for us before we say goodbye?
Just a huge thank you, and I hope
you.
one day I can come into your store in LA.
Yes,
just thank you so much
we'll
for
come in
organizing.
together.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you to the Shoah Foundation for partnering up with this event. It's just really wonderful to get to talk to this community.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and really thank you to the USC Shoah Foundation and to friends and family that came tonight. And Rachel, thank you to you for sharing your beautiful history and memory and journey with all of us. Good night, everyone. Thanks.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.